Good afternoon and welcome everybody to this year's first, actually this semester's first seminar on sustainable development. It's a great group that we got together on a real timely topic, growing up in an era of extreme events. If you're looking back over the past years or maybe a decade or so, we had seemingly an increasing number of these extreme events. Many people remember Hurricane Katrina, but we also had closer by Sandy, there was the Deep Horizon, there was the Ebola crisis. So different things popping up, and all of them seem to be somewhat related in the grand scheme of things, although they are distinctly different. And the question that is common to all of them is, how do we deal with them? What are our responses to them? And that is really where we have the experts here today to talk to us a bit about, how ready are we? And if we are ready, what does that mean? What might we have to do in response to one of these events, which undoubtedly will hit us again? And typically they come out of a corner that we don't expect at a time when we don't really expect it. So the way the event will work is we will have two keynotes. The event itself will be moderated by Chef Schlegelmilch. The keynote speakers are Irwin, Redlener, and Chef Sachs. And I will introduce the three of them, and then Chef will introduce the panel, which will come after the keynotes. So starting with I just have to get to the right paper with Chef Schlegelmilch. He's at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, where he's the Managing Director for Strategic Planning and Operations. His area of expertise includes public health preparedness, which includes planning, training, and exercising. His past work includes developing inter-organizational processes for operational epidemiological modeling, evacuation and sheltering planning for people with medical dependencies, and adapting private sector business processes to support disaster response and recovery operations. He holds a master's degree in public health from UMass in Amherst in health policy and management, and a master's in business administration from Quinnipiac University. Irwin doesn't actually need an introduction, but nevertheless, for those of you who are not who don't know him that well, we will go through the major accomplishments. Many of you probably recognize him by his voice when you drive along, and there is one of these events. You can hear him come on NPR and other media, and immediately I know, oh, this is Irwin, without even listening to who is announced. He's the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the U.S. Institute. He's by training a pediatrician, I believe, and at the NCDP he works to understand and improve the nation's capacity to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters of all kinds. He also directs the U.S. Institute's program on child well-being and resilience, which is an interdisciplinary academic center to support greater understanding of the issues, challenges, and opportunities involving children and youth. He holds a professorship here in health policy and management and pediatrics. As I already mentioned, he is a nationally recognized expert on disaster preparedness, and that includes policies, pandemic influenza, the threat of terrorism in the US, impact and consequences of major natural disasters, and related issues. Following Sandy, he was appointed by Governor Cuomo to co-chair the New York State READY Commission, and he also recently served as one of the 10 members of the congressionally established National Commission on Children and Disasters. In 2014, he was appointed by Mayor Bill de Blasio as special advisor to New York City on these topics. You might know him from his book, Americans at Risk, Why We Are Not Prepared for Mega Disasters and What Can We Do Now, which was published by Knopf in 2006. Finally, Irwin is president and co-founder with Paul Simon of the Children's Health Fund, which is a philanthropic initiative created to develop healthcare programs in 25 of the nation's most medically underserved urban and rural communities. After Irwin delivers his keynote, we will hear from Jeff Sachs, also somebody who in essence doesn't need an introduction. He's the director of the US Institute, also Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development and Professor of Health Policy and Management here at Columbia. He's Special Advisor to United Nations Secretary Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals, actually more recently more so on the Sustainable Development Goals. And he had the same position under the former Secretary General Kofi Annan. With respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, he is leading a big initiative called SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Besides that, Jeff does many things. It's actually, it would be futile to go through all his honors and recognitions. But I want to mention the 3 New York Times bestsellers that he wrote over the past 7 or so years: The End of Poverty, Commonwealth, and The Price of Civilization, which was published in 2011. More recent books include To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace, and The Age of Sustainable Development, which was just published in 2015. And when I mentioned that, if I'm driving along and hear Irwin's voice, if you are an early riser, you can listen to Jeff when he's on morning shows, among many other things. He's also widely present in the printed press, writing editorials on many topics that go from across all the spectrum of topics in the area of sustainable development. So we will start with Irwin, and then he will hand on to Jeff, and after that Jeff Schlegelmilch will take over to moderate the panel. Welcome everybody.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome all of you. I am kind of glad to be talking to you, but the topic's a little bit grim, but we're going to try to go through some key points about disasters, and Jeff is going to put it in the context of Sustainable Development Goals and sort of the status of the world in relationship to the issues that we're talking about. But I just want to make a confession to you that our program is called the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. So I know what national means. I pretty much know how to define a disaster. Preparedness, I don't know. I've been actually struggling with it, and you'll see why, because it's really not clear what we mean by a prepared world or country or community or individual for that matter. So we're actually, in our programs, in our discussions, our research, we're aiming towards an elusive conceptual goal that's relative to the current state that we're in. And I just want to mention that beforehand, that before we start getting into some of the specifics, that we kind of know what we're talking about, when we see it, but the fact of the matter is that it's an elusive definition. What we're going to try to do today is go over the current landscape of disasters as we see them. And I think the public's attention around disasters came to a head after 9/11, and since then, a lot of things have happened, as Peter mentioned. The question is, what are we looking at right now? What is germane? How do we create priorities that are the things that we're most concerned about and want to focus on? So I'm going to mention a few particular scenarios that I just want to open with about the kinds of things that we would put in. There's 2 categories, basically. One are the no warning events, and the other are more or less with warning. I have a different term that I'm using now to describe them, but just to give you a flavor of what we're talking about. So this is the city of San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake that destroyed that city. And the reason I have this here is there's been quite a bit of speculation about another major seismic event that is potentially going to happen, certainly within our lifetimes, in somewhere on the West Coast. And this is something that the country is extraordinarily unprepared for. We haven't reinforced sufficient structures. We haven't really had sufficient exploration of what are the options in response to such a thing. And I'm just mentioning that we're not going to really go into detail about this, but this is '06, and it's a question of when and if, sort of more when rather than if, we'll get a big quake on the West Coast. This represents the fact that one of the no warning events that we think about a lot is the possibility of a virus or bacteria becoming something that basically gets out of control. We talk about pandemics, this represents a virus. This is the Nipah virus, which actually is a very lethal virus for humans. It is not aggressively transmissible among people, but it could become, through mutation, quite transmissible at a moment in time that we really cannot predict. And it's representative of a class of microorganisms that, in fact, could be responsible for worldwide pandemic that could have extraordinary consequences for the whole planet. And by the way, I'm going to keep referencing some of the things that Jeff will probably go into. So the more fragile the society in its developmental trajectory, the more likely any one of these things could have a devastating effect and really pull the rug out of any progress that might have been made over the last however many years. So pandemics is another thing we're worried about. Jeb Weisman a little bit later is going to talk about cyber threats that we're now facing in the world, and he's got a very interesting take on that. I am going to mention here, this is the Fukushima disaster that we know happened in Japan a few years ago. There is a degree of risk associated with nuclear power plants for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to get into that either. Just yesterday, the Associated Press revealed a long-term investigative report on the selling and buying of enriched uranium on the black market, in particular in relationship to potential terrorist organizations. So I'm mentioning here, and I may come back to this a little bit later, the possibility of a nuclear device being bought, stolen, or built by an organization that is interested in serious creation of terror and disruption somewhere on the planet. The other no warning event has to do with the tremendous fragility of America's infrastructure. Overall, the American Society of Civil Engineers is projecting that it would cost about $3.7 trillion, that's with a TR, to really fix America's infrastructure. This is the Sacramento River Valley, and much of the levee system there is made from mud mounds, similar to what we have been seeing the last few days, really, in South Carolina. So this is a big disaster waiting to happen that if on sufficient weather conditions, this could overflow easily these very, very inadequate levees, and we'd have major flooding of the city of Sacramento. So these are things that could happen, relatively speaking, without warning, most of which we're really not even remotely prepared for. But I wanted to focus a little bit more on something that I would like to refer to as slow motion catastrophic disasters. And this bucket includes a lot of things that you may or may not be aware of. And one of them has to do with the vast cascading consequences of climate change. And Adam and Elisa are going to talk about some of that later, but I'm just, for reference, showing an area of severe drought in California. So that is one category, and you're going to hear more about that with the panel. The second thing has to do with something that I'm personally very concerned about, which is the development of superbugs, that is microorganisms that have been mutated so that they are no longer responsive to large numbers of our antibiotics. This is a really big problem. And in fact, in the United States alone, last year there were 2 million people infected with what we refer to as a superbug, 23,000 fatalities in the U.S. alone associated with superbugs. This has to do with, among other things, tremendous overuse of antibiotics. Why is that? Because Pharmaceutical companies are pushing them. Patients are demanding them, and doctors are loosely prescribing them. So that the human use of antibiotics has been out of control, and mutations have developed. But probably equally important is the use of antibiotics in livestock. So chickens, beef, etc., are very often given large amounts of antibiotics from the moment of birth through until they're slaughtered for human consumption. That also is creating these bacteria that are antibiotic resistant, a very big pending problem. This one up here, this ugly picture on the upper right is MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, and it is an example of the kind of situation that we're talking about here. On the bottom is something that we've recently begun to focus on. This has to do with this massive refugee crisis that the world is experiencing. So estimates are that across the globe, 40 to 50 million people are displaced from their communities. That means at least 10 million children are among those people and populations that have been displaced. And we've written a little bit about this, but the fact of the matter is the average duration of a child who has been seriously displaced, not from an acute event that can be fixed and they can go back to their communities, is 17 years. So in essence, we're talking about entire childhoods spent in situations of displacement, extraordinary vulnerability, and high risk to these kids. Syria, for instance, which obviously has been in the middle of a horrible civil unrest for years now, has actually used to have a very good educational system with over 90% literacy among children in Syria. 50,000 teachers have left Syria, gone, killed, disappeared. Schools are shut, and we have children who are 9, 10, 11 years old who haven't gone to school for 3 or 4 years. They're now displaced out of the country, and I don't know what it is the world expects to happen to those kids, but I'm anticipating that this is not going to be a good outcome for them or the rest of the world. And I've been pushing for much more global attention to the plight of these kids, and I think something needs to be done. But these kids are at high risk, and the societies which they'll occupy are at high risk as well. So these are the more gradual catastrophic disasters that we don't normally put in the category of, let's say, a severe hurricane or an earthquake, but they are extremely troublesome nonetheless. The overall report card for how we're handling preparedness is not good. We have big-scale disasters that are accompanied by very small planning. We have an extreme aversion to prevention. The things that we know that could reduce the chances or likelihood or mitigate disasters, we simply are just not taken care of. We don't have a mentality that I've been able to identify in the U.S. at least to say really it would be much better to prevent these situations that we've been talking about and make the investments and the resources available to help deal with them. And the other thing has to do with a failure of imagination about disasters. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. So overall, D+. If I get on the wrong side of the bed, it's otherwise it's a maybe D+, C-. C- is the grade. I want to just quickly go through two categories of issues that impair progress around preparedness. And the first of these is the scale and resources and something I refer to as the denominator problem, which I'm going to explain. And the second has to do with the structural issues and the accountability issues with respect to oversight of disaster management and prevention. And then the third, something I've been calling disaster learning disabilities. And I'll explain all this right now. So the first thing is that we don't have a grasp or a grip on exactly the scale of some disasters that we might think we've been preparing for. And let me just start with an example of a potential pandemic flu as it might impact New York City, which has a population of 8.2 million. If we had an avian flu pandemic of the type we were talking about in the 2005-2006 era, we're talking about an attack rate of 30% of the population would get this virus. That doesn't mean everybody is lethally, fatally ill. It just means that everything from mild disease or no symptoms to to deadly consequences from this situation. 10% of those who got the virus would require hospitalization, and the mortality rate would be around 2.5% of the population in New York. So what that would mean is that we'd have, over the course of the pandemic, almost 2.5 million people who would get sick with this virus, including 600,000 children. That would mean 60,000 deaths, including 15,000 pediatric deaths and 200,000 hospital admissions. So the cascade of events that follow such a situation has to do with tremendous stresses on every system imaginable. But just taking the health system and the medical services system, we certainly wouldn't have a vaccine available, and certainly not at any kind of scale that we might need. We won't have enough antiviral medications. We simply are very, very remotely distant from having sufficient number of hospital beds, ventilators, et cetera. But what's also important to understand is that the cascade of events, from isolating people, from loss of life, from people staying home to take care of their children, are tremendous consequences for the education of kids, for the local, national, and maybe international economy, and so on. Real troubles that are emanating out like ripples from a stone thrown in a pond that people have really not really grasped or made any plans for whatsoever. The notion, by the way, of assistance from the outside in a pandemic is not going to happen, because since it's a pandemic, it's happening everywhere, so we're not going to be getting help from Boston, Atlanta, Washington, and so forth. We'll be on our own, as will every other city in America. And this is a reality that no one really likes to talk about, because it's not really clear what you would do about it, even if you did think about it. But it is a problem. The Indian Point Energy Center is the euphemism for a nuclear power plant, and I know there's a lot of controversy about whether people think these are a good idea or not a good idea, but whatever you think, if there were a meltdown, Fukushima-like, at Indian Point, which is about 26 miles from where we're sitting right now, within 50 miles of Indian Point live 17 million people. An enormous presence, and depending on what the atmospheric conditions might be and other factors, a lot of people would have to be evacuated from this area. And one of the points that I've made actually to the governor and others, as many people as I could get to, is that there have been essentially zero plans made to accommodate large numbers of evacuees coming from the metropolitan area. So I guess what would happen is tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people evacuating from this region, arriving in, I don't know, get off the New York State Thruway, exit 17, I guess, and stop by Goshen, New York, where there are no hospitals, no jobs, nothing, zero has been done in any part of the United States to deal with potential evacuees from a nuclear power plant meltdown. Not a good thing. The idea of nuclear terrorism, I told you that there's really serious heightened concern about the acquisition of enriched uranium or plutonium by terror groups. One of those detonated, by the way, would not be an existential threat to life on the planet. This is not the Cold War. This is not 40,000 nuclear warheads pointed between the Soviet Union and the United States, as it was in the late 50s and 60s. But this is nonetheless obviously a major event that would be just horrific beyond description. But I wanted to point out this fact about it. So there are 6 places in the U.S. that are considered potential high target zones for nuclear terrorism. So it's Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston, Chicago, Washington, and New York. There isn't a single one of these cities that has what any of us would probably consider even minimal readiness for this. By the way, I'm not suggesting that we do, but I'm suggesting we don't ignore it. If we're going to ignore it, I really would like that to be proactively after some discussion. For example, if we have extra resources, I would like to see those invested in, say, access to health care for children. Not necessarily preparing for a nuclear weapon. But a lot of what we do is very much by default, and that's a problem in terms of disaster planning generally. A relatively small nuclear device that, let's say, occurred in Midtown Manhattan would have a significant amount of casualties and deaths, obviously very, very significant, horrible event. But this is what we'd be looking at relatively immediately, but the total hospital bed capacity in New York State is less than 40,000. Now, obviously, people who survive would be going to other places, but just to give you a sense of this, and by the way, those 40,000 beds are pretty occupied, and there would be no warning for this kind of event. So we'd have a very, very major problem, not just with the initial detonation and act of terrorism, but what we would do in the aftermath. And I don't really want to dwell on that other than to say it's just another example of things we're not really prepared for. So this is what I was referring to as a numerator-denominator problem. When you talk to people who are planning for disasters and you say, how are we doing? They will give you a number that actually is the numerator in this illustration. In other words, the Department of Health will say, we have stockpiled 1 million face masks, N95s, in the event of a pandemic. But what actually is needed may be 300 million, because you have to change them every 4 hours. It's a whole big deal. So 1 million, which sounds like a large number to the press or to the public, is actually completely, essentially irrelevant to the scale of need. And another way of putting that, as far as preparedness is concerned, if this is our starting point and this is our current state, we're never going to be 100% prepared, and I hope no one even thinks that's reasonable to think about. But let's say we wanted to be here on this spectrum. You could say we've either made progress and we're doing fine, or we're way behind because we haven't gotten here. This becomes a judgment call and actually drives decisions about how much resources from the public sector are going to be invested. So do we want to put a lot more money in and get closer, or do we want to use whatever resources we have available to do other things? I don't really have an answer for that, but I just want to point this out. The second bucket of challenges that impair progress around preparedness has to do with structure and accountability and jurisdiction. So the question of who's in charge, and I'm just going to mention two quick things. One is that the reality is that the federalist system that we live under in the United States absolutely does not work for preparedness. The federal government has literally very little control over what New York State or New York City does about preparedness, and about a lot of other things for that matter. And in some states that have home rule, like Texas, the governor has very little control over what happens in a local community or town. The mayor determines that. This diffusion of responsibility and authority for things, and in our case we're talking here about preparedness, is a major barrier to having some sense that the country is prepared as a whole. It's really a problem and very difficult to figure out how that needs to be addressed. On the global scale, some of you may be aware of the fact that the World Health Organization has been profoundly criticized after multiple investigations in terms of their response to Ebola, which was first of all delayed, and second of all, very, very inadequate on many, many counts. And if you get a chance to look at some of the analysis and reports, there's a new one coming out from the Council on Foreign Relations shortly. The World Health Organization, which I think many people might instinctively think was the place that would oversee a global challenge like Ebola, actually pretty much failed to do that. On the other hand, who should do that? You can't have an international organization march in and take over responsibility for the legal government authority and responsibility of a country. It just doesn't happen, can't happen. But when the country is dysfunctional because of a horrible disaster, for example, like the earthquake in Haiti, it is not clear how and who oversees and takes responsibility and is accountable for the outcome here. I'm just putting that out there as maybe something we can discuss later, but I'm concerned about this issue of authority and responsibility for disaster response, both in the U.S. and internationally. The final point is this issue about whether we do or don't learn from our previous disasters. So we have experiences. So the experience might be flooding in South Carolina, or it might be 9/11. We have lessons learned. I've been to, 50 lessons learned conferences after every major disaster. Same routine. You get officials come by, they talk about what we did wrong and how we're going to be better next time. And that's about it. That's where it ends. So if you look at it this way, so we have the experience, which is often called a wake-up call. I was speaking to a reporter in South Carolina yesterday, and they had a lot of issues with their levees down there and a lot of flooding, more to come. He said this is going to be a big wake-up call for the state. I said, don't count on it. Because really what happens is we can articulate the experiences as a lesson learned. That's easy. But what's not so easy is applying those lessons, fixing what was wrong, putting the right amount of resources in there, and letting that and letting the experience from before serve as a mechanism for doing better the next time a disaster happens, or make us more resilient and so forth. And this is a big problem. So told them this is not really, these don't really happen as you describe them as wake-up calls. They're really more like snooze alarms. What happens is there's a lot of arousal. Everybody's waking up. They're kind of focused on the event that's happening. There are reporters everywhere, whether it's the Newtown shootings in Sandy Hook or it's a big natural disaster, a tremendous amount of attention and a lot of rhetoric about what we could do and should do in the future. And the problem is that when the cameras leave and the reporters are gone, we hit that snooze button and we drift back off into complacency. And that's a real problem that again, maybe we can get a chance to discuss that coming up. What I did not talk about, and I could later if we had time, is the issue of recovery from disaster. And the last point I'll make is that of all the cycle of disasters, prevention, readiness, response, mitigation, the recovery part is where we have the most difficulty. This is internationally and here in the U.S. That's why we have probably, 20,000 people in New Jersey still not back to normal after Superstorm Sandy. We still have a devastated community in the lower ninth 10 years after Katrina in New Orleans. So it's a whole other discussion. Maybe we'll reconvene at some point if Peter allows us, and we'll talk about recovery, disaster recovery. But it's a real problem, and I think related to the resiliency of societies, and maybe Jeff will brush on that as well. So Jeff, would you like to come up?
Irwin, thank you for that terrific overview, which really was both comprehensive and shows what it means to be thinking about this so deeply, and thank you for doing that, and thank you for pulling us together, because we can't have enough of these meetings, it seems, until we make the kind of breakthroughs that are needed. We're speaking today about extreme events, but already I think you made an extraordinarily important point, which is that while individual events are unpredictable, what is predictable is the increasing frequency and the nature of the risk of many of these events. And so we're standing almost blind, despite the fact that a lot is known, and a lot is known among our colleagues here about estimating frequencies, risks, and so forth. And what we also know is that for a number of reasons, the kinds of events that we're talking about today are rising in frequency, or at least rising in the numbers of people that are impacted. So the vulnerability and exposure to these risks is increasing. You mentioned a number of categories. I think it's worth us keeping these distinct in our discussion going forward, because they do have different causes and different mechanisms of preparedness and response. But definitely hydrometeorological shocks, especially related to climate change, are on the rise and should be expected to continue to worsen. And we see all over the world droughts, floods, extreme storms, and reasons to believe, and we'll hear from one of the great experts, that these are related to anthropogenic climate change and therefore are likely to intensify in the future. We're suffering from a large number of ecological shocks because there's a tremendous amount of ecological displacement, meaning collisions of ecologies and biodiversity, genetic recombination of microbial pathogens that didn't occur in the past, or that is occurring at greater frequency. Most of the emerging diseases or re-emerging diseases like the Ebola infections are zoonotic, so they involve some kind of transfer of a pathogen from an animal reservoir to a human reservoir, and a lot of that is occurring because of humanity pressing upon ecosystems that they weren't deeply engaged in the past because of migration, population pressures. We know that bushmeat eating was presumably partly responsible for the biggest zoonosis of modern times, which has been the AIDS epidemic. Ebola, the most recent round, is perhaps related to bats, although nobody is absolutely certain how this latest occurrence arose. But we're seeing a lot of this, and we're seeing a lot of recombination of genetic material, probably also related to industrial production of poultry and almost a machine of recombination in China, where a lot of the new flu varieties emerge every year. Then there is no end of geopolitical, military, security, terrorist kinds of incidents and shocks, and Irwin mentioned a lot of those. And we can add cyber insecurity to the list now, and we're going to hear about that. And that's really important because we live more and more on a network that we assume is always going to be there, and everything that we need, more and more we put on there, and it's highly vulnerable, no doubt. And so this is actually a quite serious concern. And then I would say what we really find increasingly are highly complex disasters that have a bit of everything in them. And the Syrian bloodbath right now is the kind of perfect storm that reflects, on the one side, underlying ecological triggers in a decade ago of extreme drought and population displacement, very bad governance that led a brutal regime to respond to unrest with brutality, a tremendous amount of geopolitics because the U.S., Turkey, Saudi Arabia all wanted to overthrow that regime, probably at the slightest pretext. But when the pretext arose, all of a sudden arms flooded into the region. It happens that regime is an ally of Russia, so Russia's bombing in Syria and Iraq today is not outside of the kind of response. The sad truth is we know from history that this kind of continuing escalation sometimes has no end. It took one bullet to start World War I after it triggered a cascade of madness of response, threat, counter-threat, escalation, launch of war, and so forth. And so we're constantly living in that kind of spiraling risk as well. But Syria, to my mind, reflects the fact that such disasters don't ever have single, or I shouldn't say that, these days often do not have single causes and often are highly complex, spanning ecological, demographic, ethnic, geopolitical factors, and bringing them all together and making them extraordinarily difficult to address. All of these shocks we should expect will rise in frequency. Some of them can be modeled in terms of frequencies, although most of them do not lend themselves to high skill of short-run prediction, but some skill of long-term frequency estimation and identification of areas of particular risk. It's even possible to make assessments of where risks of war outbreak are. We've had a group here working on that for quite a while, and there's a lot of ability to predict that certain places are vulnerable, especially very poor places, and not surprisingly because they have very fragile socioeconomic systems. A second major point that is obvious but needs to be stressed is that every one of these crises that I know of evidences a special vulnerability of the poor. So almost any shock, you look at the eventual consequences of the shock, it can be related to socioeconomic conditions of the population at the time that the shock or the unraveling occurs. And the poor inevitably lose more. One could imagine some counterexamples, but there are very, very few indeed. And we've seen that in every case in the U.S. Shocks like Sandy or Katrina, but this is a worldwide reality, which is that in many places the shock hits and the rich walk away and the poor die. And understanding the nature of that, and John Mutter has worked very hard on that issue for many, many years to try to understand that, is important for us. Often the poor live in the most vulnerable places. They live on steep slopes. They live near the riverbanks, in places, floodplains, in highly vulnerable places where they've been pushed because that's the last place that they're tolerated, so to speak, in the society, or the place where they can get a foothold since they don't have other resources. So they're already living precarious lives. And if you look in the world today, very poor people live in drylands, highly vulnerable to drought and to food crises, for example. Not surprising, therefore, that they're more impacted. But of course, the rich always have access to resources, their own buffers, and their call on governments that are pretty quick, whereas the poor don't have such resources. It's not quite apropos of this, but when the 2008 financial crisis hit, the Wall Street Journal ran an editorial about 5 days after Lehman fell that, "Are you idiots? Don't you know there are market failures and we have to bail out the banks?" Which was the only time in 20 years that I know that the Wall Street Journal acknowledged market failures. But it acknowledged them for the rich, the richest of the rich. It never would say they're market failures for the poor. But to me, it's an illustration why the poor suffer. They don't get the editorials written for them. It's the rich and the powerful who are able to, if they don't have the buffers themselves, are able to find them. So there's a tremendous amount of scientific validation of the principle that any of these shocks has hugely unequal socioeconomic impacts. A third major finding, and Irwin is exactly at the intersection of the disaster world and the children's world, is that young children are extraordinarily vulnerable to shocks, and much more than we can imagine. And the reason is that they're developing. And it turns out biologically, you don't get too many chances to develop. And if you miss the normal biological progression of healthy development, there isn't easy catch-up. We know this, we sense this, we have our own knowledge and experiences of this. But the biology is now increasingly clear that even fetuses that face the stress of the pregnant mother during one of these episodes of disaster, or children, very young children who face episodes of disaster, may never recover, actually, especially if they face a period of nutritional stress or psychological stress or familial displacement. And therefore, we should be paying attention always to the children. For us, grown up, we are to a greater extent what we are, and we can perhaps bounce back from a disaster. But children cannot bounce back if they have a period of extreme stress caused by one of these episodes. And more we find evidence of this, and more we understand the biophysical pathways, the cortisol pathways of stress for young children leading to long-term debilities in health and cognitive development. or nutritional stresses early on that are never repaired, and so forth. A fourth finding of a careful scientific study of disasters undertaken, I'm proud to say, by many of our students in the PhD program in sustainable development in recent years, and by our colleague Doug Almond and others at SEPA, is that these shocks have very, very, very long-term consequences. And this was almost unknowable in the past when the statistical means to identify consequences of these shocks simply didn't exist. But what Doug Almond showed, for example, in research a decade ago, was that if a fetus was in a place that was exposed to the 1918 flu epidemic, the child and later adult that emerged statistically had a much greater chance of various disabilities 30 years later, 40 years later. And so the consequences of early exposure to these shocks is very, very significant. And this kind of research was almost impossible to do without some of the advances in household data sets, longitudinal surveys, and so forth. But now there have been a series of confirming findings. And what they show in general, for example, by Sao Sheng, one of our star PhDs in sustainable development, who has studied the impact of typhoons in the Philippines, it's that children exposed to those typhoons, or even as fetuses during the period of typhoons, face much higher risks of early childhood mortality stretching out for years. And so the consequences are not, as we sometimes would have thought, if you made it past that first week, everything was fine and you would catch up, but rather because of deeper biological consequences. And now it seems mothers don't breastfeed as effectively after shocks. Perhaps they're unable to, or undernourished, or without the time or the capacity, or separation of families and so forth. You get long-term consequences that can be carefully dissected if you have big enough data sets, basically, to find evidence that was otherwise not perceptible immediately on the surface. And I collected a series of these just running in this morning. I'll give you just a quick shorthand. Two of our PhDs, Jesse Antilla Hughes and Sao Sheng, who I mentioned, studying the Philippines typhoon, showed that the infant mortality effects last for several years into the future of higher infant mortality effects. Another paper of theirs showed that the economic growth consequences of these shocks is a decrement of growth, but rather small, but lasting 15 years. So that rather than seeing one big disaster, which would have been my mental image, and then you either climb out or you don't, it's a long period of loss of growth potential, when accumulated over a period of 15 years, basically is taking away a lot of the economic development of these highly vulnerable societies. So it took a massive data set and then a lot of skill in linking the data set to hurricane and cyclonic disturbances to be able to ferret out what otherwise wasn't so perceptible, that the long tail in timing means that the consequences are very, very large, even if you don't notice them jumping out at you in the macro data from one year to the next. Then more studies of intra-utero exposure to flus, to in Dutch women during the last year of World War II, a massive famine that was war-induced, and then studying children who were in utero in the winter of in the fall of 1944, winter of 1945, with serious liabilities in their life trajectories 30 years later. And this is controlling, as you would in such studies, for many, many other factors. But those few months of being in those months in gestation turns out to have these long-term effects. There are suggestions that children who are in the first trimester during Ramadan may have consequences if mothers are fasting. And so this is also another imperceptible finding, which is now being shown in very large data sets. So this is another point that I think is extremely important, that both at the individual level and at the societal level, there's a long, long period of consequence for these events. The next point, obviously, I won't belabor it, also given the time. Our societal responses are very, very weak. We simply lack institutions and perhaps even the cognitive makeup to be able to look at these kinds of challenges in a rational way. By rational way, I mean the way we would in a decision analytic framework, where we say we have these risks, we have this well-being function, we have this probability distribution, what is the optimum degree of preparedness, what's the optimum institutions for response. That's how one would think about this problem in a kind of engineering framework. But our societies seem not to do that at all, which is why, incidentally, we're going into COP21 in Paris in early December, meaning 21 years of negotiations with no success in reaching a climate agreement so far. It's not as if we don't have the evidence. And so this is just one piece of, one kind of example. But every time an earthquake hits, as in Nepal last year, oh, well, we had a building code, but it was never enforced. And so the buildings crumbled, or in Haiti, or when such shocks happen in many other places. What's true is that a few places hit by major shocks show that they did plan ahead. They did implement a building code, say the Kobe earthquake, compared to the Haiti earthquake, which almost had the same magnitude and the same distance of the major city from the epicenter, and one had a few hundred deaths, I think, maybe 5,000, and the other hundreds of thousands. And so there can be learning potentially, but in general, there is not. And I know we're going to talk about that with Hurricane Sandy. One lesson: why are backup generators always below the flood level? It was a bad idea in Fukushima. It was a bad idea in New York City hospitals. It's something that where you would imagine we could learn something, but we actually don't even learn that basic point. One interesting, dismaying fact for me from a UN point of view is that despite the fact that every year the UN is handling dozens of humanitarian emergencies, there is no funding mechanism to address them. Every single humanitarian emergency, I shouldn't say that, what there is an unbelievably deficient, almost deficient to the point of weirdness system, which is that when the shock occurs, you estimate the needs and then you go out and beg for countries to give emergency help for that. This is unbelievable. There's no doubt that the UN will need billions of dollars every year, but no money is put up front. Every single one of these disasters requires going cup in hand and having donor meetings, having emergency meetings, finding out that the pledge is only 20% of the ask, and then that pledge never materializes afterwards also, because that's just the headline for the photo op. It's not the actual money that ever materializes. So we lack completely a financial structure. So what would this mean in terms of true preparedness? This is a question that Irwin asked, and the closest we come to that analytically is a model of insurance. And an insurance model is a model where you try to calibrate as through best statistical means, frequency statistics or Bayesian analyses, a probability distribution of risks. You assess the kinds of investments that can be made in risk reduction, in mitigation, in risk preparedness, in risk resilience, and you implement financial mechanisms for risk response and for insurance. Insurance means transfers of income when bad states of nature happen to buffer those who are hit. We don't have anything like that operating, even for the most predictable seismological or hydrometeorological shocks. We don't have an international, we do have it for private insurance, but the private insurance inevitably covers only a small part of the actual risks and almost no place in very poor countries. One of the best parts of good insurance mechanisms, more or less like the building insurance in New York City, is that to get an insurance policy, you have to take steps of risk reduction and preparedness. So to have a homeowner's insurance policy, you have to show that the house is equipped with alarms, with the sprinkler system, with other risk reduction mechanisms. So insurance is not only protecting against a bad occurrence, it's reducing, if it's well-designed insurance, it's reducing the frequency and the severity of those occurrences as well through cost-effective preparedness mechanisms. One of the things we should try to do in the international system is to implement some kind of public-private insurance system, maybe literally with the insurance companies, to cover a lot of the risks that are not covered, but to use that as a leading wedge to insist on preparedness and to insist on meeting insurance covenants that building codes are there, building codes are being enforced, other preparedness standards are there, floodplain warnings are being heeded, only certain areas will be covered by the insurance and so forth. We have none of those feedback mechanisms that I can see operating right now at a systemic or policy level for almost any of these shocks. One good thing about insurance that I can mention that is the counterpart to the long tail of costs from bad shocks is that there's an equivalent literature which says that timely insurance has very, very long, predictable, beneficial consequences. So there are recent articles that show if poor children are covered by health insurance, 30 years later, they're much more likely to have a job, much more likely not to be in welfare, much more likely to have had a decent education. And so insurance coverage is really the flip side of disaster exposure, in that it also has a very long tail that is not necessarily perceived, but only now with good longitudinal studies are we able to find the very long-term benefits. This is also, by the way, related to findings on early childhood development programs, Head Start and others, where the short-term conclusions were can't find an effect, maybe not cost-effective. But when Heckman and others took out the implications of being covered by such programs 20 years or 25 years, they found very powerful effects. It was only the short term that they couldn't identify the effects. So it has something like the shock phenomenon of small benefits that accumulate over a very long period of time. And so we know that insurance would have a very, very meaningful, beneficial effect if we thought through this. Two more points that I want to mention. One is the role of technology. Technology can play an enormously beneficial role on all parts of the insurance value chain, on predictability, skill in forecasting, in risk reduction, in disaster response, simply text messaging, codes, alerts, and so forth can save vast numbers of lives. When Hurricane Mitch hit in Honduras and 10,000 people died, they died in their sleep because nobody bothered to warn them that upstream a massive flood had developed, and they died drowned on the riverbanks rather than in some violent immediate way. It was predictable for hours, but Honduras didn't have alert systems. We know that even very, very primitive or basic, I should say, safety systems like in Bangladesh to climb ladders to get out of floods has saved vast numbers of lives. So good technology can make a huge difference on all dimensions, and we should be thinking about this in a very systematic way, especially at this university. The final point that I want to mention is that last 2 weeks ago on September 25th, the world adopted a new cooperation framework, the Sustainable Development Goals. That will be our global diplomatic framework for cooperation around development issues and these disaster-related issues for the coming 15 years. I am giving the homework assignment to everybody in every speech. Go home and learn all 17 goals. Time is running out for you to be the first in your family to do so, because you'll find out that your brothers, sisters, kids, parents already know them, because I've already talked to them. So you have to go home and hurry to learn these 17 goals. But interestingly, and good news is there are 5 specific targets on disaster risk preparedness. This is not a forgotten issue in this list. And these are instructions for us, and they're leverage points for us as well. So in SDG number 1, it's end extreme poverty. Target 1.5 under that is resilience and reduced exposure and vulnerability of the poor to shocks. SDG 2 is sustainable agriculture and food security, and target 2.4 is food resilience in the face of climate change. Target 11 is sustainable cities and human settlements, and target 11.5 under SDG 11 is reduce global deaths and losses from natural disasters. I don't remember exactly how it's stated, but it's very clearly along our lines. And target 11.B under SDG 11 is that every polity, national and local, is to make plans under what's called the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction on how to address these emergencies. So there is a global call for systematic planning. And then SDG 13 is to stop human-induced climate change, and target 13.1 under that is to increase the resilience and the adaptive capacity of societies to anthropogenic climate change. So we have a framework, we have some leverage, we have some global goals. This is very timely. Let's put some content into them. Thank you.
As we move into the panel portion of our event today, I want to start by just talking a little bit about how, as a nation, we underwrite preparedness and resilience. And, you know, those two terms, preparedness and resilience, these are thrown around quite a bit in this disaster preparedness domain, but they actually mean two very different things. So the term preparedness really refers to a somewhat two-dimensional concept where you identify a threat, you write a plan for that threat, maybe you buy some stuff, you train people on it, you exercise it, and then you revise the plan based on what you found, and then rinse and repeat, right? Resilience is actually something we're just starting to understand. So if preparedness is the insurance policy to reduce risk and to reduce the loss as a result of a disaster, resilience is something additive that comes into play when different facets of a community work to solve problems together. And I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit to talk about what that means in the world of disaster preparedness. But in the United States, how we fund disaster preparedness primarily comes through the federal level and then trickles down through the state down to communities. So for cross-sector preparedness, so this is across all of the various different aspects of the continuum of responders. There are two major funding streams. There's actually a handful of funding streams that come through the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, but two of the benchmark ones are the State Homeland Security Grant Program and the Urban Area Security Initiative. The State Homeland Security Grant Program is focused on states and creating statewide preparedness systems and local projects that make the state better able to respond to a wide range of disasters. And the Urban Area Security Initiative has a little bit more of a terrorism flavor to it and is focused on the high-populated, high-threat areas. And as you can see, we've actually seen a divestment in preparedness since its peak in this time frame of analysis of 2008. We've seen the state funding reduced by about half and the urban area funding reduced by about a third. That actually masks a reallocation within the urban area funding, where a couple of the high density urban areas retained the majority of the funding and a couple of others actually lost funding. The trend before 2008 is still a downward trend. There's just some restructuring to the way Homeland Security did grants that makes it not as clean of a picture. So diving into one of the core sectors, the other major stream that contributes to preparedness flows through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The two major grants that come through there are the Hospital Preparedness Program and the Public Health Emergency Preparedness Program. The Hospital Preparedness Program is focused on the clinical setting, places where we receive care, disproportionately hospitals. And the Public Health Emergency Preparedness Program is more the wraparound, community-based public health services. And as you can see, since its peak in 2003, we've seen a reduction by over half of the hospital preparedness funding and about a third of the public health preparedness funding. In addition to this, we've seen about $1 billion cut since over this time period for baseline public health funding for all public health services, and a national workforce reduction in the public health sector of about 50,000 full-time positions through attrition and layoffs. So I guess the big question is, so what, right? The bars on the graph get smaller, you work smarter, not harder, do more with less. What does that actually mean? So in 2012, Trust for America's Health did a survey that looked at what were the impacts of these cuts in public health preparedness. And to give just a snapshot of some of the high-level things that they found, at the beginning they found a reduced capacity and capability for mass vaccine and antibiotic distribution. The irony here is that a year earlier, the public health system actually had to use this capability. There was H1N1. Everybody remember that? There was a novel vaccine, a novel strain of influenza with pandemic potential that required an off-cycle development of a vaccine that had to be distributed through this capability. And it's been used locally for outbreaks and other situations, and yet a year later, the capacity is already eroding. That we've spent so much time and effort to build up because of the loss of resources to do this. Top-level laboratory capabilities. This is a critically important one. This is your early detection and early characterization system. And this is not something that can be bought with surge funding, right? We saw the $5.4 billion for Ebola surge funding, which is critically important. And it expands your existing capabilities, but it doesn't create new capabilities. And going down to the next one, epidemiologists. One of the key investments made by the CDC over the last few decades was to rebuild the epidemiologist capacity of state and local governments to be able to go out there to detect, investigate, and understand these diseases. And we're seeing the loss of that capability. Environmental health programs. So as we look into the extreme events that we're seeing, even just over the last 5 years, how many hazardous material spills, how much risk are we incurring through the shipment of hazardous materials on the rail lines and through new ways of sort of extracting the last of the fossil fuels out of the earth. And yet, while the threat increases, our capacity to respond and understand the consequences continues to decrease. And finally, climate change. The state and local health departments, they want to plan for climate change. That's what was found. And they're having to delay that because they're having to focus on more immediate operational needs. Now, I checked, climate change hasn't delayed itself to wait for the funding to catch up. So these are just a few snapshots where some of the preparedness areas are eroding. But I want to come back to the concept of resilience as well, too. And so this is from Judith Rodin of the Rockefeller Foundation's book, The Resilience Dividend. And I think this makes a very important point. So when we look at preparedness as an insurance policy, as money you put in so you lose less down the road, I think one thing we're starting to understand is that if it's done properly, you actually build resilience, which is more of an investment that pays a dividend. So communities that are investing in resilience, that are creating those connections for solving these problems and bringing different sectors together to create broader ownership over what happens in the community, are experiencing something without a disaster ever happening. And it's translating into improved economic activities and generally a higher quality of life. And then when a disaster does strike, we're seeing less damage and a faster recovery process, but even more so, we're seeing a stronger recovery process because these communities are identifying that with recovery is an opportunity not just to rebuild, but to rebuild stronger. The converse of that is the resilience deficit. And so there is no middle ground, there is no baseline. If you choose not to invest or you fail to make the choice to invest in resilience, it's this downward spiral where you start to lose track, and then with each disaster, you're never quite able to recover back up to baseline. And so with each subsequent disaster, you're following farther and farther behind while the rest of the world moves on. So with that in mind, and thinking about resilience and what the next, what the future holds for us in terms of extreme events and what our communities need to prepare for, we'll transition now into our panel presenters. To my right is Dr. Adam Sobel. He's a professor at Columbia University's Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory and Fu Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. He's an atmospheric scientist who specializes in the dynamics of climate and weather. A major focus of his work is extreme events such as hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and droughts, and the risks these pose to human society, the present and the future. He's also leading the new Columbia University initiative on extreme weather and climate. Dr. Sobel holds a bachelor's degree in physics and music from Wesleyan University and a PhD in meteorology from MIT. He's received several awards over the last few years from the American Meteorological Society, the AXA Research Fund, the American Geophysical Union. He's the author or co-author of over 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles, which I think is more than I've actually cited in my time. And his book about Sandy, called Storm Surge, was published in October 2014 and has already received the 2014 Atmospheric Science Librarians International Choice Award in the 2006 Louis J. Braddon Authors Award from the American Meteorological Society. Thank you for joining us, Adam.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the organizers for having me. So I was asked to talk about the relation of disasters to climate change, and I want to do that because, as Jeff Sachs said earlier, all these disasters have multiple causes, so I wanted to try to put the climate change component of disaster risk in context with some of the other causes, at least to start with. So to start with what appears to be good news, I'm going to show you just a few graphs. I'm a scientist, I can't help it, sorry. This is some data on the history of really major natural disasters, and they're color-coded by type: earthquake, flood, storm, and drought, as a function of time from 1900 to 2015. And this is the number of deaths. And actually, it's surprisingly difficult problem sometimes to estimate the number of people that are killed in a natural disaster, but this is one group's best attempt at doing that. The citation is down here. It's a group in Belgium that works with the UN on this a lot. And what you see, if you look at this, you see what looks like a downward trend. I mean, the events are very rare, so it's hard to get statistical significance, but these really enormous events, these are in the millions of people. I mean, that's what these numbers are. And some of these are single events. There's a flood here in China that the estimates vary widely, but some numbers as high as 3 or 4 million people killed in a single flood. There's a drought also in China that in the 59 that's credited to be almost similarly catastrophic. So I don't think we could say that this can't happen again, millions of people killed in a single natural disaster. I wouldn't want to stand here and say it's impossible. But we haven't had one this bad in some time, and I do think some of that is real. So for example, to take some examples that I know better, if you look in 1970, there's a number here that's about 400,000. That's one storm in Bangladesh. It killed several 100,000 people. and another one in 91, that's here, that I think I actually put the little arrows, that killed somewhere between 1 and 200,000 people. The most recent comparable storm that hit Bangladesh in 2007 killed about 3,500 people, which would be a terrible number in the United States by our standards. The official death toll in Katrina was about 1,800. In Sandy, it was a couple hundred, depending whose estimate you take. So 3,500 is, you know, to us in the developed world sounds like a terrible number, but compared to what has happened in Bangladesh in the past, it's orders of magnitude lower, and that's real. The Bangladesh gets credit for that. That's working with the international community, that's better forecasting, early warning systems from the federal government down to the community level with good interaction, building shelters and getting people up above flood level, as Jeff said. So there is some success story in the history of natural disasters where in some places, including some very vulnerable places, Bangladesh is exceptionally vulnerable, we do learn things and get better, at least in dealing with these kind of short-term immediate catastrophic events. So we haven't seen as many of these truly mega disasters in terms of death in recent years. But if you look in terms of other measures of disaster, and this is measuring the number of people affected, and I'm not going to try to say how this is defined, or economic damage from natural disasters, again, for the same set of natural disasters. And this is, you know, I've included earthquake as well. This is also as well as climate-related events. And you see these numbers going up very rapidly, okay? The economic damage in real inflation-adjusted dollars, you know, skyrocketing over the last century, and numbers of people affected as well. And this is not, you can't blame most of this on climate change. Climate change is real by all means, and it is increasing the risks of some of these types of disasters, but the natural events that cause these events are not increasing at anywhere near this rate. So there has to be something else going on. And what it is basically more people moving into harm's way. So I won't, you know, that's been studied explicitly, and we could cite studies on that, or you can just look at the history of the natural events, and you see mostly just fluctuation over this time period. You don't see huge skyrocketing numbers of floods, droughts, and earthquakes, et cetera. So the number of people affected and the economic damage are going up very fast over the course of the last 100 years. Most of that is due to population increases and development in vulnerable areas. It's more people in harm's way. A lot of the economic damage increases is in the developed world. It's wealthy people building on, you know, the coasts of Florida and other vulnerable places. A lot of the human cost is in the developing world, where it's often the poorest people living in the most vulnerable areas, including on coastlines, which are vulnerable to storms and floods. But that's most of it. There is some signal in some disasters from climate change, and I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time talking about that. But what I'll say, you know, by way of introduction, is that so far, climate change is a relatively small contributor to these trends, sometimes hard to detect, but it's going to be a bigger and bigger contributor as time goes on. Now, when we talk about climate change and the influence on extreme events, we scientists in the field often get caught up in complicated discussions of uncertainty. There's uncertainties in climate change itself, but we know it's happening and we know roughly the magnitude of it. I mean, whether we're going to have, you know, exactly how many degrees of warming we're going to have by 2100 is a matter for debate, not just because of how much greenhouse gases will emit, which is the subject of the upcoming meeting in Paris that Jeff mentioned and everything else. It's also partly climate science, but there are much bigger uncertainties when you ask how these rare extreme events are related to climate change, because the climate is about averages and extreme events are rare, and so it's harder to do the science. But that discussion of uncertainty often obscures the fact that we do know quite a few things with some certainty, and those push trends, even in extreme rare events, in some pretty predictable directions. So I want to now say a few words about the relationship between certain things and uncertain things. So this is an example that I spent a lot of time on, which is hurricane. This is not my work, but I spent a lot of time studying hurricanes. And so this is a picture from the IPCC report, the most recent one, that tries to summarize what we know about how climate change should affect tropical cyclones. For one particular region I picked, the western North Pacific, which is where the Philippines, we had 2013 Haiyan, which was such an awful event. I don't know if people know, because the South Carolina floods have so dominated our news, but Guangdong province in China was hit by a category typhoon at about the same time, a couple days ago, spawned many tornadoes. Not the worst event in history, but pretty bad, actually. So western North Pacific has the most tropical cyclones in the world, so I just picked that region. And this is summarizing, you know, the direction of change in percent compared to present climate or the recent historical climate that we expect by the end of the century, given some reasonable scenario for the warming of the planet. And there's a range of uncertainty, and the 4 measures are how many storms there are altogether, how many of the strongest ones there are, category 4 and 5 in the Saffir-Simpson scale, the average lifetime and maximum intensity of the storms, and then the rainfall. And you see, though, the rainfall is almost certainly going up. The average intensity of the storms is going up. The total number of storms is projected most likely to go down, although there's quite a big range of uncertainty. It could still go up. And the number of category 4s and 5s is a complicated mix, because if there's fewer storms, but they're all more intense, then will we get more or fewer of the strongest ones, which do by far the disproportionate amount of the damage? That's uncertain. So we have, so these are complicated. None of this is easy to see yet in the observations, because the observations have so much natural variability and these climate trends are very gradual. So this is a complicated and still somewhat uncertain story that you hear from those of us in my profession about hurricanes. And when we talk about it, it makes it sound as though we don't know anything and we can't predict what's going to happen. That's misleading impression. If you're worried about coastal floods, events like Haiyan and Sandy and Katrina and the Bangladesh storms, all of these are, those hundreds of thousands of people killed in Bangladesh storms. The 2008, more recently in Myanmar, which was also in the hundreds of thousands of deaths. All of these are storm surge events. They're all coastal floods where the storm pushes water onto the land. And sea level rise is a certainty. The magnitude of it, the rate is still uncertain, but the direction of it is a certainty. A meter of sea level rise by the end of the century is now, I would safe to say, becoming a middle-of-the-road estimate of what's possible, with some estimates being higher than that. The more recent IPCC report being that being on the high end, but that was quite a bit higher than the IPCC report before that. So I think we can expect by the next one, a meter is going to be in the middle of the road. And by very rough ways of measuring this, typically depends on where the storm is and a lot of other factors. But if the sea starts a meter higher, 3 feet higher, then all the floods are 3 feet higher, no matter what, even if the storm doesn't change. And to get 3 feet additional storm surge by strengthening the storm takes about a 1 category increase in the Saffir-Simpson scale. So it's category 2 to a category 3 or 3 to 4. So that's like saying raising sea level by sort of the middle of the road amount is like jacking up all the storms by 1 category, which is a huge number. Nobody expects the storms to change that much anytime, in the near future. So that's saying that the certain thing overwhelms the uncertain thing. In other words, we know that coastal flooding risk is going up quite significantly, and we don't have to worry about all the uncertainty in hurricanes, because there's nothing they can do that's going to change that. And if it turns out we're wrong, that sea level doesn't rise a meter by the end of the century, it's a little bit less than that, it just means the same thing's going to happen, but it's going to take a little bit longer, because sea level rise is a very delayed response to climate change. And by the way, when we scientists end our plots and our projections in 2100, we're really misleading everyone, because nothing stops there. It's a very slow process after you increase the greenhouse gases to get these ultimate consequences. Storms get a lot of attention. They're very exciting. They make headlines, and there's a lot of interesting science to be done with them. So people like me spend a lot of time either in our professional lives or in the media talking about storms and floods. But I think some of the most predictable consequences of climate change are among the worst. And we spend less time talking about them sometimes because they're so obvious. But the thing we know the most about with global warming is simply the warming itself. And the planet's getting warmer. There's no question about it. It's been measured, extremely well. We can see it already. The models predict it just more or less exactly as it's happening. And it's global. It's everywhere is getting warmer, pretty much. Some places a little more than others, but unlike storms and floods, which have very complicated patterns where they're more prevalent somewhere than others, the temperature is just going up everywhere. And so this is, and this has real consequences, which I think others on this panel are better qualified to talk about the consequences than I am, but I'm just going to talk about the, what the projections are. This is from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which is a group that advises the city government on what's going to happen. It consists of a lot of people here at Columbia and NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies across the street. And the projections are, so this is the one statistic I picked, the average number of days in New York City with a maximum temperature over 90 Fahrenheit. So the historical recent average is 18 such days. The 2020s, we expect 26 to 30, and by the 2050s, 40 or 50, and by 2100, more than that. Now, over 90, we can all survive a day over 90. This also means the days over 100 is going to go up by similar proportions. My point here is just that this is really taking us into unknown territory. Those of us who have lived in New York City, for our lifetimes, who are adults, have not experienced these conditions, and I think that makes it hard sometimes. The unfamiliarity of the circumstances that are coming makes it hard to react. And I want to show one more science plot before I conclude to sort of try to give you another way of saying that this is for a report that several of us at Lamont wrote, actually commissioned by Jeff Sachs as part of a study on the Gulf states of the United States a few years ago. And the fact that it's the Gulf states doesn't matter. I could make this picture for anywhere on the, anywhere, and it would look basically similar. And what it shows is the probability of getting a particular deviation from the average in summer temperature. So 0 means you're at the historical average temperature for, in this case, Louisiana, Mississippi, et cetera. So this is in degrees centigrade, and this is the probability of that happening. So these blue is what's the recent history. So every summer is a little bit different than average. Some are warmer, some are cooler. And so an average summer happens, 30% of the time, 35% of the time. And a degree cooler or a degree warmer happens, 5 or 10% of the time. And anything beyond that basically doesn't happen in recent history. This, of course, is for the whole summer, so that's a stable statistic. Individual days fluctuate much more. These are predictions for the end of the century from the best climate models. This is now a few years out of date, but their most recent models would look the same, and the whole distribution is moved up. If you didn't understand my whole explanation of what these distributions mean, all you need to really see is that these two colors basically don't overlap. Okay, these distributions don't overlap, and what that means is that although every year is a little bit different, by the end of the century, and perhaps sooner than that, the coolest summer within the range of variability occurring at that time will be warmer than the warmest summer that anybody alive has experienced, or their grandchildren or their grandchildren. So it's just to say that the climate that's coming is really outside the envelope of what we've experienced, and I think that's a psychological barrier to dealing with these problems, that we react. There's this, Irwin talked about the snooze alarms. We try to react for a little while after there's a disaster, and then people get it when it happens. And so we're seeing, for example, in New York City after Sandy, we're seeing a lot of things happen. There are going to be fewer generators in basements now because there's this brief window where we take it seriously. But the things that haven't happened yet are the things that's really hard to bring attention to. And I think with climate change, it's a really massive problem that people just can't grasp it at the gut level that we grasp it after the disaster happens. But it's really a lot better to react to climate change before than after, because you cannot emit the carbon, but getting it out of the atmosphere is something at this point that we don't have the capability to do. We may never have the capability to do it, and reversing the climate change, is something that we otherwise can't do. So I just want to make a few points by way of conclusion. Although there's a lot of uncertainty about extreme events in climate change, we do know some things quite well. Temperatures going up and sea levels going up. The only uncertainties are about the rates, but the rates are certainly big enough to be serious problems. We've already seen significant rises in temperature and sea level. Those are already having an impact, but they're going to be bigger in the future. These affect other kinds of disasters. So temperature is one of the direct factors that makes droughts and wildfires more likely to occur. So things like the California drought that's been going on for the last several years, the best estimates from the science, most of it done here at Columbia, suggest that the rainfall deficit in the California drought is probably a result of natural variability so far, but the temperature makes it worse by cooking all the water that's already in the soil out of it. And so you get a really bad drought when you have heat and lack of rainfall at the same time. So if it's warmer all the time, then the probability of just having such an event goes up. The same is true with fires. This catastrophic wildfire season that we've seen in the West this last year is some of that's natural variability, some of it's the ongoing drought, some of it's the El Nino, but it's the kind of thing we're going to see more without question as the climate warms. And the same with sea level rise. As sea level rises, it makes coastal flooding more likely. So there's uncertainties, but there are certainties that are driving risks in a worse direction. I'm not, going to talk about this much. Others have mentioned it, and I'm sure others will after me. But the climate stress and disasters can be causes for follow-on effects like wars and forced migration, and those are not always directly counted when we look at the numbers of what the human impacts of disasters are. A lot of the counting of how many people are killed in a natural disaster is very conservative and looks at immediately attributable deaths. But if we really take the big picture, we know now that things like Syria, the Syrian conflict, which is partly drought-induced, it seems, and that drought seems to be partly climate change-induced. We're going to see more of that. So, we really need, this is so obvious as to be maybe a cliche to this audience, but we have to say it anyway, we need both mitigation and adaptation for climate. Mitigation in this context means reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's That's a very long-term thing, right? If we reduce our carbon emissions now, it has an impact that's very hard to detect in anyone's, immediate perception or time frame. But a climate agreement, if we could get a strong climate agreement in Paris this December, that saves lives. It's hard for us to see that, but it really would. And so I think we can't lose focus on that. At the same time, some climate change is happening. It's already happened, and more will happen without question. So what we call adaptation, which means dealing with it, is something we really just have to take seriously through all the mechanisms that have been mentioned so far and all that will be talked about in the rest of the time. So that's all I have, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam, for really connecting us with the science, but also with the long term, what that human impact looks like, which is such a critical piece of the puzzle in thinking about how these extreme events will impact us and our communities. So as we get set up here, I'm going to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Elisaveta Petkova. Dr. Petkova is a research associate at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness here at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Her research explores questions at the intersection of natural disasters, climate change impacts on human health, and building resilience to climate-sensitive hazards such as hurricanes, heat, and drought. She's just wrapping up a study as co-principal investigator funded by NIOSH, exploring the environmental health impacts of Hurricane Sandy on households in New York City, and is also part of a GSK-funded project that aims to assess and improve disaster resilience in 2 pilot communities with a special focus on children. She's also leading the National Center for Disaster Preparedness program development in the field of climate change, adaptation, and preparedness. She holds her doctorate in public health from Columbia University and a master's degree from the University of Minnesota, both in environmental health sciences.
Thank you, Jeff. So my talk will be about the 3 increasingly important environmental threats that Adam just mentioned: drought, heat waves, and wildfires. And in order to illustrate what kind of impacts such environmental disasters have had throughout history, I'm going to start with a story about one of the most fascinating mysteries of archaeology: the collapse of the Mayan civilization. The Mayan civilization flourished thousands of years ago in present-day Central America, and they have developed fascinating architecture as well as sophisticated knowledge and art. However, they collapsed suddenly, and scientists have been puzzled about what caused this sudden collapse. One hypothesis was that severe drought has led to the downfall of the Mayan world. And recent evidence has suggested that this as well may have been the case. This is a study by Kenneth and colleagues that has analyzed stalagmite samples and has derived a 2,000-year drought record, indicating that there has actually been a severe drought lasting for decades that happened exactly at the time when the Mayan society experienced the downfall and its eventual collapse. And even more importantly, a recent study by Columbia colleagues has indicated that aggressive deforestation has amplified the impacts of this drought. And as Professor Sachs has mentioned before, drought is never the singular reason such events happen. And it is an important environmental driver that functions together with social and political ones. This is not a novel concept. In this book by Yale geographer Ellsworth Huntington, from exactly a century ago, he explored the link between civilization and climate and noticed that many of the great nations of antiquity appear to have risen and fallen in harmony with favorable or unfavorable conditions of climate. How does this relate to the world today? As a society that is increasingly embracing concepts such as sustainable development and resiliency, aren't we able to respond to drought in a way that doesn't let it become a serious threat? Well, present evidence from Syria doesn't seem to provide evidence for that. As a result of the drought that occurred from 2006 to 2010, 1.5 million people have migrated from rural to urban areas. They have left behind livestock and have looked for work and new livelihoods for themselves and their families in the urban areas. Crop failures resulted in prices going up, and the water and food shortages, coupled with stress already experienced by the cities, eventually contributed to conflict. And something that is even more important is evidence emerging from a recent study. This one is by colleagues at Columbia as well as at the University of California that has linked the Syrian drought to climate change. And I think it is important for us as a society to start understanding that severe droughts exacerbated by climate change may not be something that we can avoid at this point. They play a major role in national security as well as international stability, and they pose really big threats as societies are really struggling with mass migration and with fighting for limited resources. This may especially be the case for regions like the Middle East that is already facing a serious water crisis. And what about countries like the United States that have much more advanced water policies and have a much more advanced capacity to deal with environmental disasters such as drought? At the moment, California is experiencing the most severe drought in its history. This chart illustrates data from the Drought Monitor. And what we can see is that today, most of the state is experiencing extreme or exceptional drought conditions. And even though the state has a substantial adaptive capacity, economic losses in 2015 alone have been estimated to reach about 2.7 billion. 21,000 jobs were lost as well. And there are many more social and public health impacts that we can't even quantify at this point, that include social dislocation, malnutrition, as well as physical and mental health. And I just want to point out that mental health impacts are especially important when we're thinking of chronic climate-sensitive disasters such as drought. And there have been many documented cases of mental health impacts such as depression and even suicide among vulnerable communities. And what is the face of vulnerability? On the picture here, we see Juana of East Porterville, California. She's a single mother living in poverty and struggling to make ends meet since her well went dry in 2011. People like her in the United States and around the world are most vulnerable to the impacts of drought and will continue to be more vulnerable in the future. Rural and agricultural communities are especially at risk because they depend on their land and the climate for their survival. People of lower socioeconomic status are always more vulnerable, as well as those living in isolation or having a certain underlying health condition. For example, people needing dialysis may be especially vulnerable. Heat waves are another growing challenge under a changing climate. And we define heat waves as periods of unusually hot weather over an extended period of time relative to local conditions. Of course, a heat wave in Australia is not going to be defined the same way as a heat wave in Germany because local populations are adapted to their climates. However, heat waves are a global threat. On this chart, I have presented data from the M-based disaster database, and we can see that heat waves occur around the world. Some of the most severe heat waves that have occurred in recent history include the one in Russia in 2010 that took over 50,000 lives as a result of smog and heat exposure. And of course, the heat wave in Europe that resulted in over 70,000 deaths, 20,000 of them in France alone. And in the United States, the most deadly heat wave in recent history has occurred in Chicago in 1995 when over 700 people died. The next chart just illustrates mortality during the 2003 heat wave in Paris. And on the left y-axis, we see the number of deaths per day. On the right y-axis, we see the temperature in Celsius. What we can see is that the death toll is rising with the prolonged exposure to heat. And this is something to remember when we think about heat waves becoming not only more frequent, but longer with climate change. We can see that on the 12th of August alone, there were over 300 deaths in Paris. And this represents an increase of over 250 deaths over the daily baseline. Now, Individuals who are young and healthy are generally not afraid of the heat, and they don't suffer from deadly consequences during heat waves. But there are certain populations, such as children and especially the elderly, who are very vulnerable. People living in social isolation as well, they have nobody to call when a heat wave strikes, and they have no way to seek help even if they don't feel well. As well as people with certain health conditions, such as obesity and diabetes, and people of lower socioeconomic status as well, are always more vulnerable during heat wave periods. There have been several great books that have explored the vulnerability of populations and have told the stories about some of the victims of heat waves. On the left, you see a book by Eric Klinenberg called Heat Wave that has explored the heat wave in Chicago in 1995. And on the right, there is another great book by Richard Keller about the heat wave in France in 2003. And something that I want to just mention because it is important is that in contrast to drought, that is a bigger concern for rural populations, heat is something that is a bigger concern for urban populations. And this is the case, one reason why this is the case is because of the urban heat island effect. The term heat island refers to the build up urban areas that are hotter than nearby rural areas. And this temperature difference can reach up to 3 degrees Celsius during the day and up to 12 degrees Celsius during the evening for a city of 1 million. So when we're thinking about the future, we know that there is a demographic transition taking place, and we're moving towards a world where there will be more elderly and more urban residents. Therefore, heat waves are not only a threat because they may become more and more intense and more and longer in duration. We will also have a larger vulnerable population that we would need to protect. And finally, wildfires frequently occur together with heat waves and drought. In 2010, in Russia, there were devastating fires that have caused 50 deaths and have resulted in 15 billion in damages between July and September. And this season in California, according to some estimates, there has been more land burned compared to the whole previous decade. And for this wildfire season alone, there has been an estimated over 200 billion in damages so far. So this is something to really think about in the context of what we may have to see more and more in the future. And since I wanted to provide a good overview of the landscape of those three threats, I didn't have much chance to talk about adaptation. But one point that I'd like to make is that successful adaptation should incorporate preparedness, response, and recovery strategy in the context of long-term climate adaptation planning. And I just want to give one example about New York City, because New York City has made a lot of progress, as many other cities in the United States, in terms of responding and planning for heat waves. So after the United States has experienced several devastating heat waves, including the one in Chicago and another one in Philadelphia, cities like New York have implemented a lot of measures, such as warnings, cooling centers, and various educational programs that protect vulnerable communities. And not only that, but a lot of work is being done now in the context of the New York City Panel on Climate Change that was first convened by Mayor Bloomberg. In this work, future projection of climate change are combined with various other estimates on human impacts in order to advise the local government how to best prepare for future impacts. And it is a phenomenal collaboration between experts from climate science, population impacts, disaster preparedness, and risk management. So with this, I just want to conclude with a couple of summary points. First, severe drought exacerbated by climate change may at this point be inevitable and should be recognized as a growing threat to national security and international stability. Second, drought, heat waves, and wildfires have wide-ranging and devastating social impacts, including morbidity and mortality, dislocation, and economic losses. And finally, the already vulnerable population, including children and the elderly, people of lower socioeconomic status, and the chronically ill, are the most likely to be affected by drought and heat waves and will likely suffer disproportionately under a changing climate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisa, for that great presentation and for really connecting the human factor with all of this. We've been talking today a lot about natural ecosystems and the impact of human activity on them and the need for human adaptation to help mitigate changes in these natural ecosystems. Our final speaker today is going to talk to us about man-made ecosystems, particularly those created by information technology and the kinds of threats and vulnerabilities that we face in terms of cybersecurity. So if your biggest concern is losing your identity and losing your data, I assure you there are much more profound things to be afraid of. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Jeb Weisman. He's the Director of Strategic Technologies for the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. He's a researcher at the Smart Lab Institute School of Engineering at University College Dublin and the Inclusive Design Program, OCAD University in Toronto, Canada. In addition, he's also the Chief Information Officer at the Children's Health Fund, overseeing developments in informatics, health information technology, and novel use of technologies to address social and cultural equality. As an anthropologist, an informaticist, and software systems designer and developer, he's a triple threat. Dr. Weisman has written, taught, and presented extensively on the challenges and opportunities posed by the unintended uses of information technology and the human systems adaptations that result. He's also been involved in global telecommunications and information system responses to both natural and human-made disasters that include responses to the 9/11 World Trade Center attack, Hurricanes Andrew, Katrina, Rita, the Indian Ocean tsunami, Superstorm Sandy, and various civil and military actions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeb Weisman.
So thank you very much. I like being the closing speaker, mostly because you're all thinking really hard about the smart things that people before me said. Personally, for me, usually when I walk into a room, people say, "Here comes the angel of death." But for once, there are people even more doom and gloom than I am. So that's great. Thanks. Often when I speak to students, I start with the typical raise your hand. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but how many of you have a smartphone, an iPad, a laptop, all that sort of stuff? And everybody raises their hands. It's 100%. Even when I'm talking to kids in socioeconomically depressed communities, schools. So this is rapidly becoming, here in the United States and across much of Europe and Asia, the standard, a standard accessory. Like a wallet or a newspaper used to be. And then ask the natural next, somewhat ironic question, how many of you could write code to make any of those devices work? And the answer is usually, except when I'm talking to kids at like engineering schools, no one. All right? And so that's a really important place to begin. It's because we don't actually understand, in large part, how the tools we are dependent upon work, okay? So this question of cyber threats and cybersecurity is extremely important because A, we don't get it, B, it's connecting us all together, and C, we are leaning on it as a response to the very things we've heard about in the room today. In fact, I think Jeff alluded to it. One of the very first things that everybody was proud of, and I was called to help with this a little bit, was bringing cell phones and internet connectivity to the refugee camps in Europe. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Technology is a connective tissue. It's also a source of physical and social disaster, and I think you can anticipate where I'm going with this, but we'll get there when we get there. Finally, we also tend to assume that technology, information technology in particular, is stable. And we are increasingly using it as a repository of knowledge. I will Google that. I don't have to remember that. I grew up on a farm. So you had to learn things, and often you learned them the really hard and painful way, but you tended to retain them. The other day, I decided to make an apple pie. It's an exciting moment in my 55 years. and I looked it up on Find Cooking, and then I had to look up a crust, and my internet connection froze, and I had to go find a cookbook, which was exciting because we had one right there in print, and now I think you know where I'm going with that, all right? We don't remember stuff, we don't know stuff, we look it up. And during a disaster, looking it up may not be the best strategy available. All we have to do is think about The Martian, which a lot of people have seen, and it's kind of an interesting book, but it teaches an important point. We can look stuff up, but if you don't know the core, the base, or the operational or functional nature of what you're looking up, you can't extrapolate, you can't learn, you can't adapt. Adaptation, as every single one of the presenters before me has said, is vital in our response to disaster. So my favorite cyber threat, 1903. It's the first modern cyber threat. They were demonstrating Marconi's exciting new wireless telegraph system, what some people refer to as the Victorian internet, and somebody hacked it. It was in 1903 and sent insulting and profane messages that the audience could see on the projected screen. The reason I call this Boundary 1 is this is a talk about extreme events. We're hearing about extremes of heat, extremes of weather, extremes in socio-political change, transformation. We have no idea what an extreme is in the cyber world. It's relatively new at a global level. It's certainly, everybody discovered the internet in 1994 when it was opened up and commercialized. We have no idea what the boundaries are. So let's start to take a look at the underlying aspects of this. Cyber threat motivations. I'm not going to read this to you. You can see it. There's no magic here. It's all the same things as the anthropologist part of my world. It's all the very same things that motivate us to do other things, motivate us to undertake threatening behaviors in this cyber universe. Now, let's talk a little bit about informing extremes. Actually, let's take a moment to talk for a moment about power and control. I talked about the cell phones and internet connectivity in the refugee camps. Phenomenal. We can connect to family. We can bring families together. We don't feel alone. We don't feel isolated. We'll return to technologies and technical communication systems that are important and modern to us, and that is great. But they are also means of social control. We can monitor them. We can use them to undermine dissent. We can use them to control communication. These are major sources of down-the-road radicalization. These are sources of, power. And interestingly, they are sources of power that transcend socioeconomic status. We can manage all of this blindly and without regard for how much money you make or, in large part, increasingly where you live. But in refugee camps, these are a group of people who are particularly vulnerable because, as Dr. Redlener mentioned earlier, children are expected to be displaced for 17 years of their lives. I saw that statistic too. That's a long time to have people managing your information and you not necessarily being aware of it. Remember, we don't know how to write code. We don't often know what's going on, so we don't know what and how our information is being used. So moving on to informing our extremes, because part of our question here is what is informing our extreme? Let's take a moment and talk about what's an extreme. Well, extreme is the far boundaries of the envelope, right? In 1903, it was hacking the telegraph demonstration with profane words, which was a pretty radical thing in the technology sense. But we have crime, right? We find new and exciting ways to undertake criminal behavior. Now, we have ideology. And you'll forgive me, but you have to mention Ashley Madison and 32 to 35 million people, depending on how you count it. Was that a crime? Was it an ideological statement, right? Because people were pissed off that information that was supposedly being erased wasn't being erased. What was it? Was it an engineering activity? These things all meld together, they blur together. But when we get down the list, we get to the cosmos and not Phil. There's a famous set of, famous recording started out, I think, on the Jack Parr show with Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner, called The 2,000-Year-Old Man. This was followed up in 13 years later with, cleverly enough, The 2,013-Year-Old Man. And there's this story about how God was found. And they're out, Phil was the leader. And Phil had a bigger club, big guy, Phil. Phil was the boss. If you pissed Phil off, he hit you. And then one day, a bolt of lightning hit Phil. And everybody turned around and said, there's something bigger than Phil. When it comes to managing information technology and things that are informing our extremes, the cosmos is way bigger than Phil. It's way bigger than us. Whether it is solar storms, it's asteroids, because the fodder of movies, floods that invade data centers, things we found in New York. The point here is that nature, physics, culture, these things all are material and social context for our information technologies and for the things that begin to define extreme events and extreme behaviors in our cyber world. Was just thinking, so we had the floods in Thailand a few years ago, technomaterially. Hard drives manufactured in that year actually undergo rapid catastrophic failure. Nobody realized this, but hard drives are manufactured where? Thailand. And even though they rebuilt the factories and even relocated them because of material changes and because of changes in the people working in the factories, we experience this cyber-related activity. Servers have been failing all over the world because of the floods in Thailand. Nobody understood why until a couple of years ago. So let me tell you another story. Not the Forbin Project. Anybody knows what that's a reference to Colossus, the Forbin Project, which is basically a dystopian story about an attempt to make a big computer that was going to keep us all from having nuclear wars. And the computer really was programmed to protect us. And as such, it basically took over. It was kind of 1984 sort of thing. Here's a different story. So imagine a setting where everybody's electronic health record is put online. And imagine that we can have genetic tests, and all those genetic tests are loaded into those databases. And then we can actually have pharmacy data stored too. So we can, order our medications online and connect them to our electronic health records. Everybody needs to see our lab information as well. And let's add some advances in personalized medicine, right? Now, I know this is a fantasy world that, started happening, 10 years ago? Let's add some advances in immunotherapy and some robotics, like robots that actually distribute pills, so that then the pharmacist just checks them to make sure that it's the right number and then gives them to you over the counter or in the hospital. And you know what? Let's program a computer to collect this information. Let's make it somebody nefarious, like me. Now, I program a computer to do this, and then I go away for 18 years. I'm collecting the information about every baby born in 2015. And 18 years from now, I have this really sophisticated model of every human being in the United States, or Germany, or in a Syrian refugee camp. But in the United States, all these 18, 19, 20-year-olds, particularly kids who are living in socioeconomically depressed communities, become soldiers. They join the Army, the Navy, and the Marines. As is science fiction, I can create a targeted cyber attack that I can launch anonymously. I don't even have to be around. I started it 18 years ago. And now I can change your medications, right? Because a robot's handling that. Or I can introduce personalized viruses. Now, I am not saying this is going to happen. What I am saying is, you tell me in 1994 that what Ashley Madison could happen today. And then let's extend this out to espionage, to global warfare, to control of populations, to somebody really, to sleeper agents. right? People who are activated later on. Well, now we just have to do it with computers, and we don't actually need people, and we walk away. Again, we're back in Angel of Death land, I know. But the point is, we don't really know what an extreme for a cyber event is, but what we do know is everything I just described can begin right now. Initiators and sponsors. Part of the challenge here is that our sophistication is growing radically. I mean radically. What we can do now is stunningly different than what we could do 5 or 10 years ago at a mass scale, right? And at the same time, we have a falling sophistication, easier entry, and shall we say, a simplified global view amongst the general populace. So people who have no idea what they're doing can pay money or push buttons, we call them script kiddies, to launch an attack, not really understanding necessarily what they're doing or not really understanding what it takes to do it. They can just do it. And once again, then we factor in climate change, which is in fact changing the demographics of technological distribution and the need and dependence on technology, and of course, Phil. So the elements of an extreme and not so extreme cyber threat, it's actually pretty simple. Hardware, computers, telecom devices, all that sort of stuff that you're all looking at while I'm talking. Software, that's the ones and zeros that people like me know how to push around. Wetware, that's your brains. And both in terms of generating this stuff and also being the victim of this stuff. And then hubris. Okay, folks, hubris, this is in many ways the punchline. I mean that in the modern sense. Hubris is it seems to be a human condition, right? It's defined by humanity. But it's this belief that it's not going to happen to us, or we can control it, or we're right, or we're right. It's going to be okay. We have all these motives and drivers, but these are the 4 elements that make up a cyber threat, and particularly will inform an extreme one. So some bits and bytes here. We don't know what extreme cyber threat is. We can imagine the worst. Launching a global thermonuclear war in war games is, sort of amazing that it didn't happen. And Eric Schlosser's Command and Control is a pretty compelling and spooky discussion about that. Or is an extreme event leaking the Sony Pictures movie scripts, or is it an asteroid hitting the Earth? What is realistic and what is conceivable? It's a rapidly advancing target. We grow more sophisticated so we can advance it and create our sleeper terrorists in 18 years. We tend to think in the here and now. Folks, this is a real problem. When we start to talk about any extreme event, it is particularly problematic. In the cyber world, we focus on the economic and reputation damage, whether it's Sony or Experian, who should have known better, and all those T-Mobile customers who got to share their data with all sorts of people around the world. Warfare and espionage come to the fore only when someone gets caught. And I don't know, at the end of the day, we need to begin to think a little bit more creative and a little more long-term instead of this thrust and parry, you did it, I did it. So I'm going to jump down. Once again, we remember the majesty that is nature, something bigger than Phil. And assuming an extreme cyber threat is survivable, and I think we can assume that, assuming it's not global thermonuclear war or the release of mass toxins in some way that we haven't imagined yet. We need to be creative to anticipate scale, scope, and novelty, adapt to variations, be resilient to recover and move on, and be responsible and fix secure critical infrastructure without politics or excuses. Where have we heard that before? So I will leave you with this. The solutions, like the problems, are exclusively human. Okay? These are man-made issues. Even in a case where a solar storm knocks out a power grid, it is because we failed to protect the grid, which we are more than capable of doing. Better design philosophy and attention to all its attendant ramifications. Better education for engineers, the general population, and policymakers. And I don't just mean the academic stuff in the science sense or the change your password sense, but ethics education as well. We are not clear anymore about what's right and wrong. That varies across the globe, but nonetheless, this is missing. And of course, Semper Gumby, which is a military term that really means always flexible. To draw on the Marine Corps, adapt, overcome, improvise. This is fundamental in such a rapidly shifting environment, such a man-made, human-controlled environment. We have to be extremely flexible. There's no picture of Gumby because that would be illegal. Because of ethics. Apply science and engineering to accommodate nature. We can't change nature. The Army Corps of Engineers has been unsuccessful doing that with the Mississippi River for 200 plus years. So at the end of the day, we must apply our science and engineering in information and other technologies to accommodate nature. Finally, there's a Gibson, not Gibson quote, the street finds its own uses for things. It's not a Gibson quote, because though it is attributed to him because it is everywhere on the internet, it was actually first coined by a Beat Generation writer. Another risk of looking things up on the internet is you get a version, not the version. But the important point here is technology, no matter how we think we've built it, is adaptable by others just as in any other engineering technology system. I would leave you with that thought. It's our responsibility, and unlike my previous colleague presenters, we can actually do something about this in an immediate, practical, and here and now sense. We don't have the excuse that it's nature. All right, thank you very much.
For the first question, Irwin, I wonder if you'll kick us off in terms of answering this one. But we talked about a lot of different kinds of disasters today, from cyber threats to extreme events. With that, and thinking about what's occurring in the near future, what should our focus be on in terms of preparing for this range of threats? Is there a single threat we should be focused on? What kinds of action should we be taking?
Oh boy.
Started you out with a softball.
Softball, right. So, we did talk about a really wide range of possible threats that something like the National Center for Disaster Preparedness is, or potentially could be focused on. And that was really just sort of the tip of the iceberg. The fact of the matter is that I think the smartest thing to do would be to focus on those things that we know are coming, where we can do something, where there's an agenda of action that may have appropriate mitigating consequences. So the cascading effects of climate change, as Adam and Elisa have talked about, will be one thing. Jeb's admonitions about what could be coming from the cyber world and things that we could do about that. I less gravitate towards things like an asteroid event hitting the Earth, which actually there are people who do think there are things we could do about that and probably should. I just have electively not put that on my to-do list. The problem is, and I guess the point I would make about priorities for disaster planning and preparedness and so forth, it's very complicated. And the thing that bothers me most about it is these are not decisions that are made by deliberation, by consultation with many sectors and with the public, and wisdom-driven conversations that result in conclusions that say, we have this much resources, this is what we're going to invest in to make our world more secure, more safe, more stable. The things happen randomly. They happen because we fight the last war, whatever that might be. We look at levees, sort of, although we really didn't even do this very well, after Katrina, because that's the last thing we had to worry about in 2006. So I guess I would only answer the question, and the question, Jeff, was about what I think we should really, what's the single thing we should focus on, and I'm totally stymied for that. But I do think some better way of deliberating and understanding what the risks are and figuring out where we're going to best place our resources. But until, by the way, we figure out the conundrum of why we don't appreciate the lessons from the last events and apply them to preparing for the next events, something that we might want to just start with as a general principle.
Great. Any thoughts from any of the other panelists? Great.
Maybe I would
Yeah, please.
say something. I missed exactly the question, but the question of focus in general. We need to do a better job of multitasking. In other words, there's lots of expertise on lots of different issues that is not mobilized in any systematic way. And we try to put the information through pretty narrow funnels of government officials who are the least trained in most of this. And this is a really serious problem. These are not political issues, actually, even though at the end of the day we want democratic oversight and discussion. There's a lot of issues that really require analytics, and then at some point the deliberation and so on, but the analytics doesn't even get done. And this, I think, is a serious problem. With all of the skill and talent we have in the world, assignment should be given to work on problems, actually, in a way. And when those problems are worked on, there's actually within knowledge communities lots of shared understandings of a lot of the issues that we've been talking about. My experience is that most knowledge communities are pretty powerless in our society right now. The expertise is there, but the political system is not really geared towards tapping the expertise, mobilizing it, analyzing issues, approving. And again, I don't want to dismiss the issue of democratic oversight. It's very real. I don't believe in turning things over to the experts, but I do believe in calling on the experts to get the expert view. And that we don't do systematically. In our government, we don't have white papers on issues where we do technical reports on these kinds of questions in a very systematic way. Strangely, we do have a National Academy of Sciences and does wonderful work. It's right next door to the White House and Congress, but there's very little interplay, strangely enough, about most of these things. And you see, of course, climate change is just an example of how completely bizarre our politics are, which is that the most corrupt or the most foolish people are in charge. And this is not good, actually. The fact that this issue is tied up the way it is with totally unserious people, unserious in one of two ways. It's hard to know whether they're as stupid as they look or just more corrupt than we can imagine. I generally go on the more corrupt side.
You could have a combo of them.
Yeah, it could be a combination of the two. But this is really a serious problem, and then attention span is an issue, but distributed processes mean many things can happen at the same time without any one consciousness having to understand everything that's happening. That's the division of labor and division of expertise. So my little mission over the last 15 years has been to try to help expert communities convey their knowledge more effectively into decision making. We don't really have to choose between whether it's biological risk or hydrologic risk or seismological risks or cyber risks. It is trying to mobilize different communities to understand this and present serious approaches, and then understand what is this political bottleneck of the kind of system that we have right now that is making it so difficult to take on best knowledge into effective institutional steps. And that, to my mind, is a lot of the question. Why hasn't the president given out 50 homework assignments on various issues? Let these groups work for a year or two. Let them make a report with the presumption that the recommendations are actually going to be adopted, with the presumption that they're going to be adopted. And think about what kind of political oversight that would require. Obviously quite different from the kind that we have right now. Our politics are really stale in the face of the kinds of challenges that we face. And they don't even give democratic oversight are democratic institutions. They're not democratic institutions anyway. So all of this is it's not meant to be a rant. It's actually meant to say that we don't have to make those choices. In principle, we should have an active learning society that taps into expertise in a very serious way, creates its checks and balances, of course, but actually implements things that we know. And again, just to say my own personal experience with the Millennium Goals, which I will do after 15 years of working on the Millennium Development Goals, every success we had was because a community of expertise, whether it was the AIDS doctors or the pediatricians or the public health specialists or the educators or any other, finally, the malariologists, they had solutions. And when they were listened to, good things happened. And almost all of the drama was getting listened to, getting heard for the knowledge, not the overwhelming complexity of the issue, but the fact that those who had the knowledge couldn't get heard. So that, I think, is part of our issue here. It really is a kind of a last mile political issue and a disempowerment of knowledge issue, it seems to me.
Okay. Thank you. Adam, I wonder if you can get us started in this next question. It talks about, we've been talking today about a lot of the different sectors that sort of intersect here between climate change and the human impacts and things like that. And the question is really, is there a discussion occurring within disaster resiliency on ways to sort of layer these different fields of exploration from climatology, sociology, community-based organizations, things like that? Is there sort of a mapping of these different fields of evidence to sort of come to broader conclusions?
They're mapping. I'm not sure if I understand exactly what the question's asking. I do think that there is a little bit of a. I mean, the academic climate scientists, many of us tend to frame things in ways that are a step or two removed from the immediate human impacts, and that's just the nature of the science that it has evolved, from studying the climate system is a different enterprise from thinking about how the events will affect people. I do think that gap is starting to be bridged. There's a field of climate impacts which, Jeff cited Salshung's work, and there's a lot of other things, the work on the Syrian drought that's done here, where there is now a serious intellectual enterprise to understand how both the human-induced changes and the natural variability in the climate system have ramifications for all the different sectors of human activity, economy, health, infrastructure, finance, economics, etc. So I don't think that. I think this question is about the intellectual enterprise, if I'm understanding it right, but maybe I'm not. But I think there's a lot left to do there. I think there still is. There are a lot of things we don't understand about what the impacts of climate change in particular are. I mean, if you look in the IPCC reports, there's Working Group 1, which is the physical sciences, and then Working Group 2, which is about impacts, and Working Group 2 is in some sense less mature, historic. It's a newer science that's going into that. But so I think we need more. But I think that's happening. And that's of course maybe the more serious issue about how knowledge is implemented is what Jeff talked about. I mean, getting the stuff into practice is another question entirely, and I think. Second everything Jeff said about that.
Absolutely. Did you want to add, Jeff?
I wanted to ask Adam a question
Okay.
also. One of the difficulties of getting to the right kinds of decisions on this is the difference of scientific proof and good policy making.
Right.
And one of the issues when you look at your confidence band, say on the hurricanes in the Pacific Basin,
Right.
What a scientist would want to ask is, are we really sure that this is going up? So you want to say, if it's a frequentist approach, can we reject the null hypothesis of no effect at 95% chance?
Right.
What a decision analyst would want to ask is, what's the right thing to do given what we know?
Right.
With these extreme events, we will need 500 years of disasters to get the 5% confidence band.
Right.
Whereas with if the question were asked from a decision analytic point of view, we'd say, do you think there's a 10% chance that we're down the road of disaster and we should head off that 10% chance by taking insurance on it right now?
Right.
So we'd ask the question in a very different way, but still using the same kind of maybe a Bayesian framework for the probability estimates, but we wouldn't care about rejecting a null hypothesis. We would try to understand what is the distribution of risks given what we see. Do you see some movement in the scientific literature that we could link that up with the decision analytic framework, so we're asking a question in the way society actually wants to know it, because they're not really, the scientists do have this 5% or 1% standard for a good reason, which is you don't want things to enter the scientific literature that aren't true.
Right.
And so there's a bias towards not rejecting the null hypothesis. But from a life point of view, we really want to move in a different direction, which is precaution, insurance, avoiding the worst. And how can we link this up in a fruitful way, actually, between the two different interests?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, Jeff. This is an important point about not just science, but also language. I mean, you're absolutely right. The climate scientists, like many other scientists, we try to reject the null hypothesis. Null hypothesis, just before getting into the language of risk, I mean, the null hypothesis of no climate change is something that really bothers me. We ask, is there do we know with 95% confidence that we can reject the hypothesis that the human-induced climate change had no influence on something? There's no reason to think like that when we know that that shouldn't be our prior, that there's no climate change when we know there is. But anyway, that's one thing. But you're right. We should be thinking about things in terms of risk. Rather when it comes to influencing policy, rather than rejecting things at 95% confidence. And I don't know how far that concept has made its way into the normal climate science literature. It certainly is making its way into the communication of climate science in the media. I think more of us in the field are coming to understand that we have to learn to talk this way if we want anybody to understand what we're up against, because that's the reality of it, is that the risks are increasing. We should be thinking about the risk of extreme events and the risks of not just individual extreme events, but extreme, that our assumptions about climate change could be conservative on the low end, that instead of getting 3 degrees of warming for a doubling of carbon dioxide, we could have 5 or 6 degrees. That we tend to talk about the central estimates, but there's a real probability of the worst outcomes, and we have to accept that. I mean, it's I think the people who are good at this is the insurance industry. They think this way, and I think there's starting to be more communication between the field of climate science and the insurance industry, and I think it's coming. I mean, this change in mindset is coming. Whether it's gone all the way or not is another question. But you're dead right about that. And
it would be interesting for you guys to make a point technically that how long would it take actually to get the proof at the traditional level? And how many centuries do we want to have to wait if the alternative hypothesis is actually true?
Right. Well, I mean,
in other words, given the power of these events, how far do we want to go, and do we want to say that our threshold from now on should be a 50% interval or 30%, or rather than a 5%?
Right. I mean, the notion that we know we have a lot of sources of information about the change in risk in climate. It's not just counting the events and seeing how the frequency is changing. You're right. That we'd have to wait 500 years to say whether some Category 5 hurricane is really, this much more probable just from from the observations, but we know a lot more about than the observations, and it's that.
That's what the
it's
skeptics
all
are
that,
forcing you to do.
Well, but I think we have to learn not to listen to that. I mean,
Yeah.
we have to make the case that we know a lot of things. But when it comes to some kinds of events, like, heat waves, and some of the other larger scale events, they're really much more predictable, and I think we don't have to wait.
Yeah.
I mean, we
Because
can
they're
see now,
Right.
in some cases, the fingerprint of human influence. So I think it really isn't that. So with that's why I focus on sea level and temperature, because I think those are direct factors increasing risk of a number of kinds of disasters. And there's really, I don't want to say there's no uncertainty. Uncertainties are only about the rates of change, but the direction of change and the approximate rates are pretty well known. So I think we scientists overemphasize the uncertainty because it's what we spend our days worrying about, and we don't understand sometimes that we go out to talk to the public, that the public needs to hear what we know and not what we don't know, which is what we fight about amongst ourselves. So anyway, that's a communication issue, but it's a real one.
Adam, let me just ask so if you're articulating what you just said to a journalist who invariably after the last hurricane says, is this climate change induced? Is it human behavior influenced the climate change that is leading us to this place? There still has to be an answer that's comprehensible, that is not dismissive of the climate forces, but doesn't undermine your ability to stay accurate in terms of reflecting the science. So what do you say?
So here's the right answer to that, I mean, the best that I've been able to come up with after a few years of thinking about this. So hurricane, weather event X happens, and almost doesn't matter whether it's, the South Carolina flood or anything else. The reporter calls and says, was this climate change? I think we have to say a few things. We have to start by saying the climate is changing due to human influence. We know that. This is about how much it is. Now, when you ask about extreme events, it depends on the kind of extreme event it is, but with many kinds of events, and this goes for very intense tropical cyclones, floods caused by heavy rainfall events, heat waves, and some droughts, we have to say this is the kind of thing that the best science we have indicates with a reasonable amount of confidence, in some cases great amount of confidence, we are going to see more as the time moves on. This kind of event is becoming more probable. Now, any given extreme event that happened today, we can't necessarily say there's a large climate change fingerprint there. And in part that's because there's a what we call selection bias, but it's related to the anthropic principle that the cosmologists talk about. How is it that among all the possible universes, the one that happened is the one that has people in it? Well, if it didn't, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. It's the same with extreme events. We focus on the really extreme events because they're rare, and any really rare event, almost by definition, has a large element of chance in it, so that if we ask, where did this event come from? The hurricane, almost certainly there were hurricanes 500 years ago. It's not, you don't need climate change to cause a hurricane. So when you zoom in very closely on that one event, it's hard to identify a huge climate change fingerprint. But when you look out at the patterns, we actually know quite a bit. So I think what we have to do is start from what we know, which is the climate is changing. We see the patterns going in these directions for reasons that we're pretty confident about. Now, if we zoom in on this one event, it had a lot of different causes, but if the question we're asking is, should we be concerned about climate change because it's increasing the risk of disasters, the answer is generally yes. But that's a different question than, what are all the factors that caused this to happen today in South Carolina? So I think we have to learn how to frame those questions separately and not get caught up. And many climate scientists, when the reporter calls, we start out by saying, well, any one event isn't due to climate change. And that's all true, but that's because that's the argument we're used to having with each other, because we all know that climate change is happening and it's a serious problem. So we're not used to having to communicate that.
Yeah.
We have to remember that that's something we have to communicate.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to resilience and preparation and all those things, it most of the time doesn't matter that much, really, because we're often underprepared and under-adapted to the climate we already have. Sandy, we shouldn't have had, all the sewage treatment plants and the power stations right on the water. We shouldn't have had everybody's generator in the basement. All those things, even with no climate change, we shouldn't have been doing. So fixing all those things is the same things you should be doing to prepare for climate change. You may have to, do them a little more, but we're so under-adapted now that a lot of these things are no regrets action. So that's the other side of it. We don't really need to fight about exactly what the climate change impact is, often in the short term, to know what to do. But if we're thinking about, is climate change a concern? Are these disaster risks a reason that we should be taking the Paris, COP meeting seriously? The answer is yes to that, and we don't have to get caught up in the, the detailed factors in exactly what happened in South Carolina.
This actually segues nicely into a few of the other questions that we have here. And actually one of the first ones, and I know, Elisa, in your summary slides, you talked about the importance of climate adaptation. And I think that's also another one of those terms that we kind of throw around a lot, climate adaptation. And I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about what does that mean in terms of like what kinds of actions does that mean, and what do we mean when we say climate adaptation to folks who are maybe outside of the field?
Before I continue to this question, I just want to add something I wanted to add regarding mapping risk within communities. And a very useful tool that we're developing within the Center for National Center for Disaster Preparedness is collecting individual and household level data on various impacts of disasters, for example, Hurricane Sandy. With this data, we can characterize better resilience within communities. We can characterize the gaps in resilience. We can characterize what kind of impacts our individuals experience. Mm-hmm. And then using this information, we can go to community organizations and help them communicate the risks to their people. We can go to policymakers and explain how does vulnerability look within communities. And the point that I wanted to make in terms of climate adaptation and disaster preparedness is that it's important to combine the two so that we can look both for short-term and long-term solutions. So climate adaptation includes various actions that cities are already taking, for example, in New York, to adapt to the various projections of climate change such as sea level rise. There is a lot of work that is being done on making infrastructure more resilient. And there's a lot of work being done on reducing health impacts within populations. And as I mentioned, heat is one of the most easily measurable impacts, both in terms of the physical projections and as a consequence in terms of the human health projections. So all of the actions that we can take on both the individual, community, city, and state, and even international level that can prepare populations to better deal with what we may face in the future is very important to, in order to adapt better.
And moving along those lines, this one touches on the technology piece of it as well too. And Jeff, maybe you can get us started on this one. And this one is specific in many of the Sandy-affected areas. There are a lot of these best practices of crowdsourcing and self-organizing that a lot of times are driven by technologies. And to your knowledge, kind of how are the benefits of these technologies being shared across fields? And are there any sort of new vulnerabilities that they introduce as well?
Well, I think it's, first off, yeah, we should be really, really clear. There are two primary benefits to these sort of populist technologies at the time of disaster. One is it helps people bring resources and attention to areas, communities, problems when they happen. There was a great project that started off after the Indian Ocean tsunami called Sahana. It's now a global piece of software for managing resources and material. And so in that sense, it's phenomenal. The second interesting sense is in its capacity to maintain and manage community during a time of crisis. And that's in many ways more important. And I think it speaks to one of the reasons everybody rushed out to help bring these technologies to the refugee camps. And it'll be very interesting to see what the long-term effects of that. So in that sense, wow. I mean, really, it's pretty amazing. The number of people who are brought together, the number of sources that are brought to bear. At the same time, there are two risks that I'll present. There are a variety of additional benefits and risks. The first benefit is, and then it disappears. We saw after Sandy, in particular, all of these pop-up sort of really well-meaning charitable organizations, and then school started, or someone had to go back to work, or they couldn't afford their internet connection that week, or whatever, and they kind of disappeared. And that leaves a void, particularly when there was a very active community of engagement that just disappeared overnight. Okay, so that's always the challenge of a grassroots thing. The second challenge, and I mentioned this when I was speaking, is the opportunity to subvert a positive use of technology for nefarious needs or for power, command, and control. That's inevitable. It's happened forever. It's not new. But to change messaging, to collect information, to sort of spy and subvert is the downside. So I think those are great dangers. I also would add, finally, I talked about my sleeper example. Everybody kind of looks at me like I'm crazy, which may well be true. But think about changing those big data sets we've been talking about that provide us with these long-term, difficult to tease out outcomes. And we all look at this incredulously, but we know that data are changed. And once we start creating opportunities for data for what we call man-in-the-middle of attacks, where we can inject new information into the data stream, what happens to the science? And so I think that's as much a risk beyond the immediate social impact. I think we have to be very careful. We need to really begin to understand and take the blinders off that there is a long-term risk to the quality of our sensor data, to the quality of our inputs, when we are so dependent upon things we don't understand to collect them.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts on that? I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then just any closing thoughts from the panelists. Yep, please.
Could I ask Jeb? Maybe I shouldn't ask this, but if the most malevolent mind wanted to undermine.
So here I am.
Undermine our data flows, what is discussed in the cyber community in terms of that we wake up one day and we no longer get email, can't get online? What kind of things could lead to that?
Well, I think we have to start with the notion that maybe it's already happening. And one of the problems with such a, this is a very abstract, it has very concrete in my cell phone presence, but it's taking place in a plane, in a context that we can't see. So we honestly don't know what we are or aren't getting. And I don't mean to sound paranoid, because I'm actually not really that, there's no diagnosis that's been officially, but to return to your question, I think the first thing we need to do, and I think this goes right back to the questions about climate change and action, is we need to decide that we care about this. We need to stop treating this like a can of soda, like a commodity. We look at what happened at Experian, right, with this massive data breach. That was sloppiness. Now, the history of the credit reporting agencies is directly tied to the history of our intelligence agencies, okay? That's another conversation for after this. That's not paranoid, that's documented. In-Q-Tel's the CIA's, venture capital firm. They do great work, frankly. They do great work. But we have not decided this is important to us. We have not decided that voting machines shouldn't be subverted. Until we do those things, until we decide this is important to us, we can't begin the science of protecting ourselves. And there is good science here.
But Jeff, to Jeff's point, what could conceivably get really bad? I mean,
take your pick.
What?
I mean, it doesn't take a lot to shut down the internet. It doesn't take a lot to turn off the routers. It doesn't take a lot to introduce what we call denial of service attacks. The fact of the matter is, on a large scale, and it doesn't take a lot of knowledge to do it anymore. The script kiddies I mentioned, it's really not tough. It's precarious. I can, one person can shut down Columbia University. Not that I'm suggesting anybody would. This is not technically difficult. And because of the commoditization of the technology we are now using, we do not necessarily understand how easy this is.
But how much from your discussions with the community come also from the fact that we have two huge interest groups here. One is the intelligence community, and the other are the big operators like Google and so forth, which have the mega servers. And they have a strong interest in us not understanding these systems.
Correct.
Because they're doing a lot of things that are really unpleasant. One commercially and the other from a surveillance point of view.
True.
One has the feeling that it's absolutely massive and beyond our understanding and probably pretty ugly and very powerful and linked. So have we already lost this battle, or is there a serious discussion, in your opinion, about?
There's a very serious discussion. Have we lost the battle? Let's change that a little bit. I don't. Yeah, maybe we've lost the battle, but not the war. The problem is, once again, is this commoditization. We just like what we have, and we don't want to have to think about it. There are many technologies and tools to manage this problem. They exist. Part of it is an inability of my domain to communicate with the people. A part of it is if you are not clearly affected, why would you care? And so I think the answer is it's an ongoing set of arguments and discussions that the tools exist. They're much easier and much more available should we choose to do it, but we don't seem to have the will to do it. I'm not really sure why, and I don't think my colleagues really understand why we aren't all using Tor. Except if you use Tor, you're actually profiled by the federal government, by the intelligence community. So why would you use Tor? Because I don't want my credit rating affected, you know.
What's Tor?
So Tor is it's a little piece of software you can use that allows you to talk to the internet without anybody knowing who you are and what you're communicating. Obviously, bad can take place. We can sell drugs and uranium. But it also means you don't need to know the political conversation I'm having, that I'm a dissenter or that I'm different. It's plug and play, but the minute Tor shows up in your profile, you immediately become, you're flagged.
Person of interest.
Well, beyond a person of interest, you're actually formally flagged, and the information technologies are automated. So it isn't some little gray person deciding that Jeb should be flagged. It's a computer flagging you for later use. Welcome to the McCarthy era.
So on that cheery note, we're actually, like
Angel
all
of
great
death, I win.
academic discussions, we're just about out of time. Peter's going to come up and close us out and talk about the next Sustainable Development Seminar Series. But join me also in just thanking all of our presenters today.
Yeah, thanks again to Jeff as moderator, all the speakers and panelists. I just wanted to draw your attention to the next seminar in this series, which will be on October 26, our typical time slot from 4 to 6. And the topic is Toward Food Security in Cuba. The organizers will be Pedro Sanchez, who is director of the Agriculture and Food Security Center, and Cheryl Palm, who is a senior research scientist at this center. So I hope I will see many of you at this event. And thanks for coming.